What if I told you that love in the Middle Ages wasn't about roses, moonlit walks, or knights in shining armor? Imagine a world where devotion meant suffering, where desire was twisted into torment, and where women were treated not as partners but as prizes to be won, traded, and conquered. Welcome to the horrifying truth behind medieval romance. Before we dive deeper, hit that subscribe button. The story is just beginning, and it's far darker than you can imagine. In the medieval imagination, love wasn't meant to bring happiness. Instead, it was a system of ownership, hierarchy, and cruelty. Knights didn't fight for glory, they fought to prove devotion to women they often couldn't have. Courtly love, celebrated in songs and poetry, glorified unrequited desire, endless longing, and exquisite suffering. The more pain a man endured, the more noble his love was considered. Picture this: a young knight falls in love with a married noblewoman. He writes poems about his torment, fights duels in her name, and dedicates decades of his life to worshiping someone who will never return his affection. Each rejection, each insult, each cold glance is fuel for his adoration. In the medieval mind, suffering itself was the highest form of devotion, but women were not spared from this cruel philosophy. They were expected to remain distant, aloof, and unapproachable. A kind word or gentle gesture would cheapen them, make them seem ordinary. To be admired from afar was the ultimate proof of their virtue, and every act of affection could diminish their social standing. In this world, misery was a mark of status and happiness was forbidden. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't a romantic union, it was a business transaction. Children were betrothed as young as 7, their futures bargained like livestock, land, and gold. Fathers didn't ask if their daughters would be happy. They calculated the political and financial gain. Dowries and inheritances determined a woman's worth, and her consent was often irrelevant. These marriages were binding contracts enforceable by law, with penalties for refusal. A bride who couldn't produce a male heir could be returned to her family as if she were defective merchandise. Love was irrelevant. Genuine affection between two people was suspicious. If a young couple wanted to marry for love alone, their families feared something was wrong with the arrangement. Many child brides never saw their families again. They were shipped off to foreign lands, strange households, and households that viewed them as breeding stock or political insurance. Their existence became a function of property duty and social climbing. Love, compassion, or comfort were luxuries they could not afford. The medieval church made matters even more sinister. Sexual pleasure was considered sinful even within marriage. Couples were instructed to treat intercourse like medicine, a duty to be endured quickly and with guilt. Forbidden days filled calendars. Sundays, religious holidays, Lent, Advent, and countless other occasions left only a fraction of the year for sanctioned intimacy. Women bore the brunt of the church's teachings. Female sexuality was considered dangerous, inherently lustful, and a trap set by the devil to ensnare men. Men were to control their desires rigorously, while women were simultaneously blamed and punished for theirs. Marriage became a regulatory system to contain the evil of human desire under the guise of morality. Medieval men didn't just court women, they conquered them. Kidnapping, dueling, and violent displays of dominance were celebrated as ultimate romantic gestures. The stronger, more brutal, and more fearless a man was, the more his love was considered genuine. If he hesitated, failed, or spared the woman's life, he was deemed unworthy. Tournaments weren't just sports, they were deadly spectacles designed to impress women. Knights clashed with swords and lances while ladies watched from stands cheering for blood and courage. The more violent the battle, the greater the proof of a man's devotion. Modern MMA looks gentle compared to these medieval displays where "till death do us part" was more suggestion than promise. Romantic violence extended beyond tournaments. Men were expected to duel rivals, start wars, and commit brutal acts to prove love. Gentle, peaceful suitors were mocked as weak and unworthy. Medieval literature repeatedly taught that dominance, aggression, and martial prowess were not only attractive but essential to winning a woman's heart. The infamous rite of the first night illustrates the twisted logic of medieval romance. Lords claimed the legal right to spend the first night with any newlywed under their domain. Rather than a scandal, this was portrayed as the ultimate romantic test. Could the husband fight for his bride's honor? If not, he was unworthy. Violence was literally a measure of love. Women in medieval society were considered property. Marriage laws, dowries, and inheritance practices reinforced this system of ownership. Women were not independent actors. They were rewards, assets, and trophies. Love was merely the packaging around a system designed to transfer property between men. Adultery laws reveal the underlying philosophy. If a woman cheated, she hadn't betrayed her husband emotionally, she had stolen his property. Women were treated like livestock, and men competed to acquire the most desirable prizes. Love, affection, and partnership were irrelevant. Only ownership mattered. Capturing women during raids or wars was glorified as the ultimate romantic achievement. Literature romanticized kidnapped women falling in love with their captors. These narratives reinforced the idea that women existed to be seized and conquered, further solidifying the link between violence and romance. In medieval society, a woman's legal identity was almost non-existent. Fathers controlled daughters, husbands controlled wives, and men's claims over them were absolute. Women could not own property, sign contracts, or testify without male consent. Romantic narratives merely masked the reality of their subjugation. The concept of mutual love was almost incomprehensible. Women were objects, not partners. A woman's preferences, desires, or feelings were secondary to her role as a collectible prize. Love existed as a contest among men with women as the ultimate rewards in a hierarchy of possession. Tragic love was glorified over happy unions. Medieval literature celebrated lovers who suffered or died rather than live comfortably together. Stories like Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere held up heartbreak and tragedy as the pinnacle of true love. Lifelong happiness was considered mundane and unworthy. Medical texts even treated love as a potentially fatal disease. Love sickness could justify bloodletting exorcism or other extreme remedies. Suicide for love was not only accepted, but romanticized. The ideal love story involved mutual destruction rather than compromise or survival. Medieval people genuinely believed that love was supposed to consume and destroy you. The more intense the suffering, the more noble the affection. It wasn't enough to simply be with someone. The true measure of devotion was how much anguish and despair you could endure for your beloved. Courtly love turned misery into an art form. Knights composed intricate poems and songs lamenting their unattainable lovers, celebrating rejection as proof of virtue. Suffering was performative, a social badge, signaling both devotion and refinement. The more a man suffered, the higher his status in the aristocratic love hierarchy. Women, meanwhile, were trapped in a system of paradoxical expectations. They were to remain cold and distant, proving their worth while secretly desiring to be pursued and conquered. Showing genuine affection would reduce their status, so emotional torture became mutual. Both men and women were expected to suffer elegantly. This was not fiction. Medieval nobles structured real-life relationships around these principles. Entire lifetimes could be spent in emotional agony, crafting identities around unrequited passion, and elevating heartache to the level of cultural performance. Love was a competition and misery was the prize. Child marriage reinforced the transactional nature of medieval romance. 7-year-old girls were often betrothed with legally binding contracts that transferred property and political alliances rather than affection. Families negotiated brides like livestock measuring value in land, livestock, and dowries, completely disregarding the girl's desires. The bride herself had virtually no agency. If she failed to produce male heirs, she could be returned to her family like a defective asset. Young girls were shipped to distant households, sometimes in foreign lands, expected to adapt immediately to a life where they were tools of diplomacy, economics, and social mobility. Love, in this context, was dangerous. Genuine romantic desire was suspicious and could disrupt carefully arranged contracts. Emotional attachment between children destined for arranged marriages was often discouraged, as it interfered with political strategy and social stability. Sexuality was tightly policed by the church. Pleasure was morally suspect. Desire was equated with sin. Even within marriage, sex was a duty performed with minimal enjoyment and maximum guilt. The calendar dictated when couples could be intimate, and transgressions were seen as spiritual corruption. Women were considered particularly perilous in this system. Their sexuality was framed as inherently dangerous, a threat to men's souls. Female desire was demonized, creating a culture where women were simultaneously blamed for male temptation and punished for expressing their own needs. Marriage was less a celebration of union than a containment strategy for human sexuality. Celibacy was morally superior, and marriage was tolerated only as a mechanism to control what was viewed as humanity's corrupt desires. Love, in its most natural forms, was framed as a battlefield between morality and the body. Violence was inseparable from medieval courtship. Men didn't just woo women, they dominated, kidnapped, and fought for them. What modern society would call assault was celebrated as the ultimate proof of devotion, a thrilling display of courage and masculinity. Literature glorified the abduction of women. Tales of knights seizing the women they desired were framed as heroic adventures. The woman's consent was irrelevant. Her abduction signaled the knight's passion and elevated his honor in the eyes of peers and chroniclers alike. Tournaments were not sports, they were bloody performances of love. Knights would crash into each other at full speed, clad in heavy armor, vying to impress noblewomen. The more violent the clash, the more proof of romantic fervor. Modern UFC seems gentle by comparison. Romantic violence extended beyond tournaments. Men were expected to duel wage wars and commit acts of brutality in their beloved's name. Failure to demonstrate martial prowess was a mark of unworthiness. Medieval love equated physical dominance with emotional authenticity. Women were conditioned to find this aggression appealing. Literature and cultural narratives constantly portrayed violent, domineering men as ideal partners. Gentle, kind men were considered undesirable. Strength, brutality, and risk-taking were marketed as the true language of love. The notorious rite of the first night illustrates this worldview. Feudal lords claiming sexual rights over newlywed brides was framed as a test of valor and protection. A husband's willingness to defend his bride, even at the cost of his life, became a twisted romantic ideal. Women were treated as property and trophies. Knights competed for the right to own a woman whose gratitude was expected. Marriage contracts and romantic poems mirrored property language. Adultery was theft, not emotional betrayal. Women existed as collectibles within this system. Capturing women in war or raids was romanticized. Victims of abduction were expected to develop affection for their captors, and literature celebrated this as the pinnacle of love. Agency, consent, and personal desire were irrelevant. Ownership and control defined the romantic narrative. The legal system reinforced women's lack of autonomy. They could not own property, make contracts, or testify in court without male permission. Love was entirely externalized, a man's conquest, a father's transfer of ownership, a woman's passive experience of being claimed. Medieval romance was fundamentally performative. Noblemen competed for the most tragic, agonizing love stories. Emotional suffering was elevated above joy, and death for love was celebrated as the ultimate romantic act. Living happily ever after was considered unworthy of true nobility. Tragic love was idealized. Stories of Tristan and Isolde Lancelot and Guinevere Abelard and Heloise became templates for what love should look like: intense, forbidden, and ultimately destructive. Happiness was secondary. Suffering was the measure of devotion. Medieval nobles actively engineered romantic suffering. They created obstacles, manipulated social circumstances, and orchestrated conflicts to ensure their love stories were dramatic and painful. A dull, harmonious relationship was a mark of mediocrity. Dying from heartbreak was considered noble. Medical texts described lovesickness as a real, sometimes fatal condition. Physicians prescribed extreme treatments, bloodletting exorcisms, or strict diets, demonstrating that even medicine was weaponized to reinforce emotional torment. Suicide for love was romanticized. Medieval literature brims with lovers choosing death over separation, each portrayed as heroic rather than tragic. The idea of recovery, moving on, or finding new love was seen as shallow, dishonorable, or unworthy of nobility. Mutual destruction was the pinnacle of medieval romance. The perfect love story involved two lovers causing each other's demise through passion conflict or social pressures. Tragedy was celebrated as the true testament of love's intensity. Romantic philosophy encouraged obsessive longing. Courtly love demanded sleepless nights fasting and emotional anguish as signs of devotion. Pain was a virtue, indulgence in happiness a sin. The more tortured, the more noble the lover. Women, too, were trapped in these rigid codes. Their worth depended on maintaining distance, coldness, and aloofness. Any display of affection or vulnerability was deemed cheap, threatening their social standing and their perceived virtue. Marriages were strategic tools. Children, as young as 7, were promised or forced into unions to secure land wealth or military alliances. Families assessed daughters' value as property, negotiating dowries with the precision of merchants indifferent to emotional well-being. Women were sent far from home, sometimes to foreign lands, where they were expected to obey husbands and families alike. Isolation reinforced dependence, obedience and acceptance of their reduced status, normalizing psychological subjugation as part of marital duty. The Church enforced strict moral codes around sexuality. Pleasure within marriage was condemned. Desire itself was framed as a manifestation of Satan. Married couples were subjected to calendars dictating when intercourse was permitted, often leaving only a few dozen allowed days per year. Sexual desire was demonized. Women were particularly blamed as sources of temptation, accused of dragging men toward sin. Female sexuality was both feared and policed, reinforcing the idea that women's bodies were morally dangerous and needed constant control. Marriage became a system of damage control. It contained the evil of human sexuality, channeling it into socially acceptable forms while denying pleasure or agency. Celibacy was idealized. Marriage was merely a lesser evil to avoid damnation. Romance and violence were inseparable. Acts that today would be criminal abductions, forced displays of power, public domination were celebrated as demonstrations of love. The more risk and brutality involved, the more authentic the devotion appeared. Knights proving their love often risked death in tournaments. These events were staged as spectacles of blood and power, where the audience, particularly women, were expected to swoon at displays of physical dominance and martial skill. Duels, skirmishes, and wars were justified as romantic gestures. A man unwilling to commit extreme acts in the name of love was deemed unworthy, showing that medieval society equated heroism, violence, and romance. The notorious rite of the first night was reframed as romantic testing. Lords, claiming authority over newlyweds, were seen as asserting dominance with the bride's suffering, portrayed as a measure of true love and marital legitimacy rather than a violation of her autonomy. Women were treated as prizes. Marriage and courtship revolved around ownership, with men competing to acquire the most valuable partners. This system dehumanized women, reducing them to collectible objects in a patriarchal hierarchy. Adultery was treated as theft. Women were legally considered property. Infidelity was interpreted as a man stealing another man's possessions. Romantic betrayal was framed entirely in terms of ownership, not emotional connection or consent. War and raids offered opportunities to win women as trophies. Captured women were expected to develop affection for their captors, normalizing trauma as a romantic prerequisite. Literature reinforced this, portraying abducted women falling in love as the ultimate romantic victory. Medieval romance was about control. Women had no legal identity, separate from their male relatives, could not own property or enter contracts independently. Love was not a shared experience, but a social and political performance where women existed as objects, not participants. The notion of choice in love was alien. Women didn't select partners. They were assigned, bartered, and transferred like commodities. Marriage was dictated by familial strategy, wealth consolidation, or political gain, not mutual affection. Courts prized spectacle over genuine emotion. Public displays of suffering, devotion, and romantic agony were performed as markers of status. Aristocrats measured their worth not by happiness, but by their ability to endure and display emotional torment. Tragic love was glorified. Dying for love was celebrated as the highest expression of devotion. Stories of lovers perishing from heartbreak set the standard for what true love should emulate: pain, loss, and ultimate destruction. Fiction and reality blurred. The heroic narratives of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, or Abelard and Heloise, were treated as templates instructing nobles that personal suffering was a necessary ornament of genuine love. Aristocratic love demanded elaborate, self-imposed obstacles. Lovers engineered situations that ensured misery, false rejections, impossibly timed encounters, and social manipulations, turning life into a stage for romantic suffering. Medical science endorsed the madness. Lovesickness was diagnosed and treated as a literal disease. Prescriptions ranged from bloodletting to exorcism, suggesting that passion itself was a health risk, a dangerous affliction requiring management. Suicide for love was normative. Literature portrayed self-destruction over unfulfilled romance as heroic. Partners dying together was romanticized, reinforcing the idea that living happily with one's beloved was a lowly, unworthy goal. The medieval formula equated love with mutual annihilation. Genuine affection required total emotional and sometimes physical destruction, a shared obliteration of identity and life, in the pursuit of idealized devotion. Shakespeare merely recycled old ideals. Romeo and Juliet's narrative wasn't revolutionary. It reflected centuries of cultural conditioning, where love was inseparable from tragedy, suffering, and societal approval of emotional extremity. Ultimately, medieval romance was a system that celebrated ownership, violence, and suffering. Love wasn't a mutual bond. It was a stage for social performance, a tool for control, and a measure of endurance, leaving the participants trapped in cycles of misery masked as nobility.